The office door clicked shut with a sound that felt like a death sentence. Evelyn Harper felt her blood turn to ice when Derek Morrison twisted the key in the lock, the metallic sound echoing through the soundproofed room like a final verdict. She was alone with him on the second floor of Velvet, Miami's most exclusive nightclub, where the pounding bass 3 floors below would swallow any scream she could possibly make. Derek turned slowly, his silver-streaked hair catching the dim light, and his eyes gleamed with something that went far beyond anger or desire. It was possession. It was absolute control. The smile that never quite reached his eyes now twisted into something predatory, something that made every survival instinct Eve had developed through 27 years of hardship scream in warning. And in that moment, she knew with terrifying clarity that she had completely underestimated the man she had been working for over the past 8 months. He took a deliberate step toward her, and Eve backed away until her spine pressed against the cold glass wall. There was no way out. No one to hear her. No one who would come. Or at least that's what she thought. Because 3 floors below, in a private VIP room where deals worth millions were made and broken, Dante Valenti had just received an alert on his phone, an alert from the hidden camera he had installed in this very office 3 weeks ago, and what he saw on that screen made his blood run cold and his hands curl into fists. Derek Morrison was about to learn that touching what belonged to the king of Miami's underworld was a mistake he would not live long enough to regret. If you want to know what happens next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this story. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and share this with someone who loves intense stories that grip you from the very first sentence. 6 months before that fateful night, Evelyn Harper stood before the fogged mirror in the employees' changing room at Velvet, one hand tugging a white shirt over her shoulder, and then she stopped when her eyes caught the scar. Time had softened it, leaving only a pale ripple of a line on her skin. But Eve knew it was there, would always be there, like a reminder of the night her father hurled a liquor bottle at the wall, and a shard of glass flew into her shoulder as she tried to shield Ethan. Ethan, her little brother, the child she had sworn to protect at any cost. Stillwater, Oklahoma was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's name, where family secrets were tucked behind polite smiles and closed doors. Eve's mother died of cancer when she was 12, and that was when Robert Harper, the father who had once been gentle, turned into a man Eve no longer recognized. Whiskey became his breakfast, rage became his dinner, and the bruises on Eve's and Ethan's bodies became the secret the whole town knew but no one spoke of. That night, Eve was 19, sitting in the back seat while her father, dead drunk, took the wheel on the winding hill road that led home. Ethan was in the front passenger seat, 16 years old, trying to keep the steering straight while their father shoved his hands away. Eve still remembered Ethan's scream, the headlights of a truck surging toward them, and then the darkness. When she woke up in the hospital, Ethan was gone. Eve testified against her father in court. She stood there at 19, with her arm in a cast and her eyes dried out because there were no tears left to cry, and she told everything. The beatings, the bottles. That night, Robert Harper was sentenced to 5 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, and Eve was sentenced to life by the very town that had raised her. Family traitor, ungrateful daughter. Those words followed her like ghosts when she left Stillwater with a backpack and $300 in her pocket. Memphis, Atlanta, New Orleans. 8 years passed like torn pages, each city a promise that failed to hold, each job a rung on a ladder that led into nothingness. And then Miami appeared, with neon lights and promises of anonymity, of a chance to begin again. Eve pulled the shirt down, hiding the scar, and looked straight into her own eyes in the mirror. This was her last chance. She could not be allowed to fail. She stepped out of the changing room and walked toward the manager's office, where her interview would take place. The man behind the oak desk introduced himself as Derek Morrison, Velvet's manager. He had silver at his temples and the smile of a professional salesman, the kind of smile designed to make other people feel at ease. But Eve had met too many men with that kind of smile. Right away she sensed something strange in the way he looked at her, his gaze lingering a beat too long on the curve of her throat, on the way the shirt clung to her body. A flicker. Only a flicker. But enough to make Eve feel as if someone had just stepped across her grave. She pushed the feeling aside. She needed this job. She needed money. She needed a place to start over. So Eve smiled, shook Derek Morrison's hand, and said she was happy to work at Velvet. Eve did not know that when she walked through Velvet's doors that day, she was not only starting a new job, she was stepping into a world where the line between life and death was as thin as a blade. Lisa was the first to warn Eve. She was Velvet's veteran bartender, a woman in her 40s with dyed red hair and eyes that had seen too much to be capable of surprise anymore. On Eve's first day, when the two of them were wiping down glasses after closing time, Lisa leaned in and said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper that Eve should never, ever stay alone with him after the club closed. Eve asked why, but Lisa only shook her head, her eyes darkening as if she were staring into a memory she wanted to forget. She said nothing more, and Eve did not press. She had lived long enough to know that sometimes silence spoke louder than any words. For the first 2 months, everything seemed normal. Derek Morrison praised Eve's work, saying she was one of the best bartenders he had ever hired, that customers loved her, that she had a bright future at Velvet. Those compliments came with touches that seemed accidental, his hand brushing her shoulder as he passed, his fingers grazing the small of her back when he stepped behind the bar to check something. Eve told herself she was overthinking it, that it was just the way he communicated, that not everyone had bad intentions. But by the 3rd and 4th months, she could no longer lie to herself. Derek began to comment on her appearance, saying that dress made her look amazing, asking why she did not wear her hair down more often, remarking that her lips would look better with red lipstick. He scheduled Eve for the late shifts, the shifts when the club was thin on customers and short on staff, the shifts that gave him more chances to be alone with her. In the 5th month, Derek told Eve he was taking her to dinner. Not an invitation, but a statement, as if he had already decided she would say yes. Eve refused, polite but firm, saying she did not date coworkers. He said nothing, only looked at her with an expression Eve could not read. The following week, her schedule was thrown into chaos. She was moved to the worst shifts, the nights with the smallest tips, the hours that forced her to walk home in the dark. Eve knew it was not an accident. That Thursday night, the club was emptier than usual. Most of the staff had gone, and Eve was alone cleaning up the bar, wiping spilled liquor, and lining up the half-used bottles. She did not hear Derek's footsteps until his breath warmed the back of her neck, thick with whiskey. He murmured in her ear that she knew he could make her life here very easy, or very hard. Eve turned, and for the first time in 6 months, she looked Derek Morrison straight in the eye and said, no, not a gentle refusal, not a polite smile with an apology, just no. She told him that if he touched her one more time, she would go to the police, she would go to human resources, she would tell everyone exactly what kind of man he was. Eve waited for rage, waited for him to shout or threaten her, but Derek did nothing at all. He only smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes, and asked her who she thought human resources would listen to, the new bartender or the manager who had worked here 5 years. Then he turned and walked away, as if that conversation meant nothing, as if Eve meant nothing. But before he vanished through the door, Eve saw something shift in his eyes. It was no longer desire, it was something darker, something more dangerous, something Eve had seen in her father's eyes on the nights he drank too much. Derek Morrison was not just a harasser, he was a collector, and Eve had just become the thing he was determined to have at any cost. 3 weeks before that fateful night, Dante Valenti sat in a black Mercedes parked outside an Italian restaurant in South Beach, rubbing his temples and trying to push back the pulsing headache left behind by a meeting that had stretched for 4 hours with partners from Colombia. 36 years old, and he was tired. Tired of tense negotiations, of threats disguised in polite language, of having to wear the mask of a boss who never showed weakness. He looked at Luca, his bodyguard and driver, waiting in the front seat for orders, and all at once he wanted to disappear, just for one night where he was not Dante Valenti, the man who controlled 60% of Miami's underground operations. He told Luca to go home, that he wanted to go alone tonight. Luca protested, saying it was not safe, but Dante only looked at him in a way that needed no words, and Luca fell silent and nodded in obedience. Dante traded his $3,000 suit for black jeans and a simple leather jacket, clothing he had almost forgotten the feel of. He drove a plain rental car to Velvet, one of the nightclubs in his empire, a place he had never entered as an ordinary customer. He came for a reason. Over the past week, whispers had reached Dante about Derek Morrison, the manager he had hired 5 years earlier, rumors about the way he treated female staff, about girls who had quit and no one knew why, about the look in his eyes when he watched young bartenders. Dante did not care whether Derek was a good man or not, but he did care that someone was staining the name of Velvet, of the empire he had built. So he came to observe, to assess, to decide whether Derek Morrison was still worth keeping. He took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey neat, and that was when he saw her. The woman behind the bar had brown hair pulled back neatly and amber eyes that met his when she asked what he wanted to drink. Not the averted glance most people gave him when they sensed the power coming off him, not the frightened or fawning look he knew too well. She looked at him as if he were just an ordinary man who needed a drink after a long day. And that, for some reason, made it impossible for Dante to look away. She smiled as she set the whiskey in front of him, and it was the truest smile he had seen in years. No calculation, no hidden purpose, just a simple smile. She asked if it was his first time at Velvet, and Dante heard himself lie that yes, he was new to Miami, still getting to know the city. She nodded and began to tell him about places tourists usually missed. Little eateries with real Cuban food, quiet beaches where locals went, her voice warm and enthusiastic as if she truly wanted him to have a good experience in this city. In the middle of their conversation, a drunk man began causing trouble at the far end of the bar, slamming his hand on the wood and demanding more alcohol even though he was no longer sober. Dante watched how Eve handled it, how she walked over with a calm but firm presence, how she told the man she would call a taxi to take him home and the next drink would have to wait until next time. She did not humiliate him, did not shame him in front of others, but she also did not let him cross the line. It was toughness wrapped in compassion, and Dante realized he was looking at her with something beyond curiosity. When he left, Dante tucked $500 in tips beneath the empty glass. He had barely stepped outside when he heard footsteps running after him, and he turned to see Eve there, money clutched in her hand, breathless, saying he had made a mistake, that this was far too much. Dante looked at her under the flickering neon, her hair slightly loosened from hurrying, and for the first time that day he smiled. He told her she deserved it, then turned and disappeared into the darkness before she could protest again. He drove home in silence, but his mind kept returning to the image of those amber eyes, that smile, the way she chased him down just to return money most people would have kept without hesitation. Dante had come to Velvet tonight to investigate Derek Morrison. He had not expected he would find something else, something he did not know he had been searching for. This was the first time in years anyone had treated Dante like an ordinary human being, and it was also the first time the boss of Miami felt his heart, the thing he had believed dead for a long time, begin to beat again. 1 week later, Dante returned to Velvet. He told himself it was for business, that he needed to keep investigating Derek Morrison, but deep down he knew it was a lie. He sat in the same spot at the bar, and when Eve saw him, she smiled as if she were welcoming an old friend instead of a customer. She remembered he drank whiskey neat, and that small thing warmed Dante's chest in a way he did not want to admit. That night the club was busier, but in the brief pauses between serving customers, Eve still made time to talk with him. They spoke about life, about the cities they had passed through, about dreams that had broken along the way. Eve said she was from Oklahoma, a small town she had no intention of returning to, that her family was complicated, and that was all she wanted to say. Dante heard the hurt in her voice, the way she changed the subject quickly as if she were running from memory, and he did not ask more because he understood. He understood because he, too, had dark corners he did not want anyone to touch. When Eve asked about him, Dante said he worked in business, that his job demanded pressure and hard decisions, that sometimes he was tired of wearing a mask every day. It was true, just not the whole truth. Eve nodded as if she understood, and maybe she truly did, in her own way. By the third time he came back, 2 weeks before that fateful night, Dante could no longer deceive himself. He sat there watching Eve work, watching the way she smiled at customers, the way she skillfully slipped away from drunken hands that tried to touch her, and he realized he was developing real feelings for this girl. That was dangerous. Dante knew it better than anyone. In his world, emotion was weakness, and weakness could get him killed. He had built this empire by letting no one come too close, by keeping his heart frozen behind walls of steel no one could pierce. But Eve, somehow, was melting those walls without even knowing they existed. At the same time, the investigation into Derek Morrison produced results Dante did not want but had expected. Luca placed a file on his desk, reporting that over the past 2 years, 3 female employees had left Velvet, all young, all new, and all silent about why they went. One of them moved to another state only 2 weeks after quitting. Another refused to talk when Dante's people approached. The third, when asked about Derek Morrison, cried and hung up. "Derek has a pattern," Luca said, his voice cold and even as if he were reading a weather report. "He targets new hires, people who need the job, people who have no one to protect them." Dante sat still in the darkness of his office, fingers tapping lightly on the desktop, and thought of Eve. She was a new hire too. She needed the job too. She had no one to. He ordered Luca to install a hidden camera in Derek's office, the kind even experts would struggle to find, the kind that streamed directly to his phone 24 hours a day. He also told Luca to watch Eve from a distance, to make sure she was safe on her way to work and on her way home. To protect an employee, Dante said. But Luca looked at him with the eyes of a man who had followed him long enough to know when his boss was lying. That night, alone in the penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay, Dante stood by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand and wondered why he cared about this girl so much. He had met hundreds of women more beautiful than Eve, more powerful than Eve, women willing to do anything to earn his attention, but none of them made him want to protect the way he did now, to shield her as if she were something precious he could not afford to lose. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, as if he were not the monster all of Miami feared. Maybe it was her smile, honest and warm in a world built on lies. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because for the first time in his life, Dante Valenti wanted to become a better man for someone. Dante did not know that the decision to install that camera would save Eve's life in only a few weeks, and that very decision would change both their lives forever. And now we return to that fateful night, the soundproof office on the second floor of Velvet, where Eve stood with her back against the icy glass wall as Derek Morrison advanced on her one step at a time. He drew his hand from the pocket of his vest, and the dim light in the room caught on the small blade resting in his palm. Not a big knife, just the kind of switchblade a person could hide in a wallet, but sharp enough to carve wounds Eve did not want to imagine. Derek smiled, the smile of a predator that had finally driven its prey into a corner, and he said she had had 6 months to do this the easy way, that he had given her enough chances, enough time, but she kept insisting on making it difficult, so now they would do it his way. Eve tried to slip to the left, toward the door, but Derek was faster than she expected. He grabbed her arm, yanked hard, and when Eve struggled, he slapped her with enough force to make her ears ring and the world tilt and spin. She hit the floor with the copper taste of blood on her lips, and before she could get up, she felt a sharp pain spear through her right side. Derek had sliced a line along her ribs, not deep, but enough for blood to seep through the white shirt, enough for Eve to understand he was not playing, that he was willing to do far more if she did not behave. She backed away until her spine met the wall, one hand pressed to the bleeding wound, and watched Derek come closer with the knife still in his hand. She thought of Ethan, of the little brother she had failed to protect. She thought that maybe this was how she would die, in this soundproof room, where no one would hear her scream. 3 floors below, in the VIP room where Dante sat alone with his drink and the screen of his phone, everything changed in an instant. He was watching the feed from the hidden camera the way he always did whenever he came to Velvet, a habit he would not admit to anyone. When he saw Derek pull the knife, time seemed to freeze. Dante saw Eve fall to the floor, saw the blood blooming on her shirt, and something inside him, something he had kept buried under layer upon layer of control for so many years, erupted like a volcano. He did not say a word. He stood, set his glass on the table with a slowness that was terrifying, and walked out of the room. Luca saw his boss's face and understood immediately that something very, very bad was happening. He and 2 other men followed Dante without asking, because when Dante Valenti moved with that stride, with those eyes, questions were a luxury no one dared to have. Dante drew a gun from the holster hidden beneath his jacket as he climbed the stairs, step by step, not rushing but not wasting time either, the footsteps of a man who had already decided exactly what would happen in the next few minutes. In the office, Derek was pressing Eve into the corner, the knife lifted level with her face, cold steel against her cheek as he hissed filthy words into her ear. Eve closed her eyes, bracing for the worst, praying to whatever God might be listening that if she had to die, let it be quick. And then there was a blast. Not gunfire, but the door exploding off its hinges, wood splintering and metal flying. Derek turned, the knife still in his hand, and what he saw drained his anger into fear in a single heartbeat. Dante Valenti stood there with the gun in his hand, eyes like ice and as dark as a pit. Behind him were Luca and 2 armed men, but everyone knew they were only for show. Dante did not need anyone to handle this. Eve opened her eyes, and for a moment she could not believe what she was seeing. The man in the doorway, the man with the gun and the eyes of a killer, was the man she had talked with at the bar, the one who had left $500 as a tip and smiled at her as if she mattered. She did not understand. She could not understand. And yet, at the same time, relief flooded her chest, because whoever he was, he had come for her. Derek tried to speak, stammering that she had seduced him, that this was a misunderstanding, that Dante did not know the real kind of girl she was. But Dante did not let him finish. He only looked at Luca and said 2 words in a voice so calm it was chilling. "Take him to the basement." Luca and the 2 men moved toward Derek, and the man who had once been Velvet's powerful manager began to scream. He begged. He promised he would leave the city. He would disappear. He would never touch anyone again. But Dante did not look at him. Dante's gaze had shifted to Eve, seated against the wall with blood soaking through her shirt and her face gone pale with shock. Only when Derek was dragged to the doorway did Dante turn back, and what Derek saw in those eyes made him stop screaming. There was no mercy, no hesitation, only the cold certainty of a sentence already handed down. Dante spoke a single line, his voice low and even as if he were talking about the weather. "You touched what belongs to me." The office fell into a silence so tight it felt suffocating after Derek was dragged away, leaving only Eve's ragged breathing and the bass from downstairs thudding up through the floor like the heartbeat of some enormous beast. Eve stayed seated against the wall, one hand clamped over the wound that still seeped warm blood, her eyes fixed on the man standing in the middle of the room with a gun still in his hand. And then, from somewhere far away, a sharp crack echoed up. A gunshot. Just one. Eve did not need anyone to explain to understand that Derek Morrison was never coming back. She waited for fear to arrive, for disgust or horror at the knowledge that someone had just died because of her. But all she felt was emptiness, and maybe, underneath it, a thin ribbon of relief she did not dare admit. Dante slid the gun back into the holster beneath his jacket and moved toward her, slow and careful, not threatening, as if he were approaching a wounded wild animal. He knelt in front of her, his dark eyes taking in the spreading stain on her shirt, and without a word he gently pulled her hand away to check the cut. From an inner pocket he drew a white handkerchief and pressed it to the wound to stop the bleeding. His hands, the same hands that had ordered a man's death minutes ago, were unexpectedly gentle when they touched her. Eve watched him work, watched those long, strong fingers wrap her up with careful precision, using the expensive cloth without a second thought, and she could not stay silent any longer. She asked him who he really was, her voice rough but steady. Dante paused, lifted his gaze to hers, and for a moment Eve thought he would lie, but he did not. He said his name was Dante Valenti, that he was not a tourist new to Miami, that in truth he owned this place and many others as well. He controlled things ordinary people did not want to know about, things that lived in the dark underbelly of this city, things that, if she knew them in detail, would make it impossible for her to look at him the way she once had. And he had been watching her for the past 3 weeks, not because he was a pervert like Derek, but because he wanted to protect her from that very man. Eve listened, taking in each piece of information as if she were swallowing bitter pills one by one. She did not cry. She did not scream. She had lived long enough to know this world was not made of black and white, only countless shades of gray, and the man in front of her, whoever he was, had just saved her life. When Dante finished, Eve asked only one question. "So what now? What will you do with me? I know too much." In the movies, this was the moment the Mafia boss would threaten her into silence or death. Eve was ready for that. But what Dante said next froze her. He told her she had 2 choices. First, she could leave. He would give her money, a new identity, a new life anywhere she wanted. California, New York, Europe, anywhere. She would disappear and never have to see him or his world again. Second, she could stay. With him. Dante said those last 2 words in a lower voice, his eyes never leaving hers, and Eve realized this was not an offer from a boss to his prey. This was the offer of a man gambling everything on her answer. Eve thought about her life. 27 years. 27 years of running. From her father. From Stillwater. From the memory of Ethan. From every place she had ever called home. She had belonged nowhere for so long, drifting from one city to the next like a leaf carried by the wind. Rootless, with no harbor to land in. And now the most dangerous man in Miami was kneeling in front of her, binding her wound with his own handkerchief, asking her if she wanted to stay. Eve looked into Dante's eyes, and she saw something familiar hidden beneath his coldness. Loneliness. The same loneliness she saw in the mirror every morning. He might be the king of an empire, but he was also a man with no one he could trust, no one to come home with, no one to look at him as a human being instead of a monster. Just like her, Eve opened her mouth, and she surprised even herself with what she said. "I choose to stay." Dante did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted. as if a door that had been locked for a long time had finally cracked open. He rose, offered her his hand, and Eve took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His hand was warm and steady, and as she stood there only inches from him, Eve realized she had just made a decision that could change everything. That night, for the first time in her life, Eve slept in the arms of a man and felt safe. She did not know that safety would be paid for in blood and tears in only a few months. 6 months passed like a dream Eve did not dare believe was real. She was no longer a bartender at Velvet. Instead, she became Dante's right hand in managing the finances of his empire. It turned out that the years she had spent doing part-time accounting to survive in city after city had given her a sharp eye for the irregularities other people missed. She spotted numbers that did not line up, suspicious transactions, unreasonable expenses that even men who had worked for Dante for years had never noticed. Miami learned something very quickly, that Evelyn Harper was not merely Dante Valenti's girlfriend, that she was not some expensive piece of jewelry the boss kept at his side for the pleasure of looking at. She had power of her own, a voice of her own, and anyone who dared to dismiss her would face consequences not only from Dante but from Eve herself. They lived in the penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay, where Eve woke each morning to sunlight pouring through enormous panes of glass and the scent of coffee Dante had already brewed for her, breakfast together on the balcony, where they could see all of Miami stretched out below them. Kisses before work, private nights when Dante showed her a tenderness he kept hidden from the entire world. Eve learned that the man all of Miami feared was the man who cooked for her when she was sick, the man who remembered what kind of flowers she liked, the man who could sit for hours just to listen to her talk about the books she was reading, even though he did not care about literature at all. But even the most beautiful dream had darkness stalking its edges. Eve still had nightmares. Some nights she dreamed of Derek and his knife, dreamed of the soundproof office and the feel of her back against that ice-cold glass wall. Some nights she dreamed of Ethan, of her brother's eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror before the car rolled. Some nights she dreamed of her father, of the stench of whiskey and the sound of breaking glass, of the scar on her shoulder she still carried. On those nights, Eve woke with a scream strangled in her throat and tears running down her cheeks, and Dante was always there. He did not ask. He did not demand an explanation. He only pulled her into his arms, held her tight, and stayed until she could fall asleep again. That was what Eve loved most about him, his ability to understand that sometimes a silent presence was worth more than any words of comfort. 1 week before their 6-month anniversary, Eve was sitting at her desk in the home office when she noticed something strange in the books. A string of small transactions, each one only a few $1,000s, not large enough to draw attention but enough that their pattern made her frown. Money was being transferred to an offshore account, steady as a pulse every week, starting about 1 week after the night Derek Morrison disappeared. Eve meant to call Dante to ask, but just then her phone rang, an emergency at one of the clubs, and she forgot. She told herself she would ask later. She told herself it did not matter. On the night of their 6-month anniversary, Dante had reserved a table at their favorite Italian restaurant, where they could sit in a private room and not be disturbed. They got back to the penthouse around 11 at night, Eve leaning into Dante's shoulder in the elevator, happy and content in a way she had never imagined she could feel. But when the elevator doors opened, they saw it. A white envelope placed directly in front of the penthouse door. No sender's name, no address, only a single line of messy handwriting on the outside. For Dante Valenti, Eve felt Dante go rigid beside her. He bent to pick up the envelope, opened it, and read what was inside. And for the first time in 6 months of knowing him, for the first time since she had seen him standing in the office doorway with a gun in his hand, Eve saw real fear on Dante Valenti's face. His skin went pale under the hallway light. His jaw clenched, and the hand holding the paper trembled slightly. Eve did not know what the envelope contained, but she knew that whatever was coming, it would change everything. That night, when they were celebrating their 6-month anniversary dinner together, a nameless envelope was left outside the penthouse door. Dante opened it and read, and for the first time in her life, Eve saw the face of the man she loved turn pale with fear. Eve read the paper in the envelope over Dante's shoulder, and each word hit her chest like a bullet. I know what happened to Derek Morrison that night. I have photos. I have a witness. $5 million in 7 days. Or the FBI and the Morrison family will get it all. No signature, no contact information. Only a Swiss bank account number and a line of handwriting in black ink, like dried blood on white paper. Eve had never seen Dante lose control. Over the past 6 months, she had watched him face the most tense situations. from negotiations that fell apart to threats from rival gangs. And he was always calm, always cold, always a wall of steel nothing could pierce. But tonight, that wall collapsed. Dante threw the paper onto the table, and before Eve could react, he swept his arm and knocked a wineglass off the marble tabletop. The crash of shattering glass rang through the silent penthouse, red wine spraying like blood across the white floor. He roared for Luca, his voice something Eve had never heard before, packed with rage and packed with fear, ordering him to summon every one of the most trusted men immediately. Not tomorrow, right now. While Dante paced like a caged beast, Eve sat down on the sofa and began to think. She had learned how to control emotion a long time ago, back in the years with her father, when the wrong reaction could earn her another beating. She forced herself to stay calm, forced her mind to analyze instead of panic. Derek Morrison had vanished completely. Dante had made sure of that. No body, no trace, nothing that could tie his death to anyone in the organization. So how could there be evidence? How could there be photos and a witness? Unless someone had been watching them from the beginning. Someone who knew about the camera Dante had installed in Derek's office. Someone who knew about that night, about the basement, about the gunshot. Someone inside the organization, close enough to know everything but smart enough to hide in the dark for 6 months. Eve stood and moved to Dante, set her hand on his arm, forcing him to stop and look at her. She said they had 7 days, that 7 days was enough time to find the traitor. Dante looked at her as if she were crazy, as if she did not understand how serious this was, but Eve did not flinch. She offered a plan. She would investigate the finances, follow the trail of money, because money always left a trail, no matter how hard people tried to hide it. Dante would investigate the people who had motive, who had opportunity, who might have betrayed them. They would split into 2 lines of attack and meet in the middle. And as she spoke, a memory flashed through her mind. The strange transactions she had found the week before. Small sums transferred to an offshore account, steady every week, starting about 1 week after the night Derek Morrison died. She had meant to ask Dante about it but forgot. She had told herself it did not matter. But now, as the pieces began to fall into place, Eve realized it might be the most important clue she had ignored. Someone inside the organization had been receiving money. Someone had been paid to watch, to gather evidence, to wait for the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. Eve did not tell Dante what she had found. Not yet. Not when she still did not have enough proof. She only tightened her grip on his arm and told him they would find whoever was behind this, that she promised him. Dante looked at her, dark eyes full of worry and full of something else as well. Maybe love, maybe gratitude that she was beside him in this moment. He nodded, said nothing, but he pulled her into his arms and held her tight for a single second before letting her go to prepare for the emergency meeting with his trusted men. Eve stood alone in the middle of the penthouse, staring at the shards of glass on the floor and the stain of red wine like blood, and she told herself the blackmailer had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were taking on a mafia boss. They did not know they were also taking on a girl from Oklahoma, a girl who had learned how to survive when she was still a child, a girl who had stood in court and testified against her own father, a girl with nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. The blackmailer thought they were taking on a mafia boss. They did not know they were also taking on a girl from Oklahoma, a girl who had learned how to survive when she was still a child. Eve did not sleep for 3 days. She sat in the office of the penthouse, the laptop screen casting a blue light over her pale face, cold cups of coffee stacked on the desk like a defeated army. Her eyes burned from exhaustion and from staring at numbers for too long, but she did not dare stop. 7 days. They had only 7 days, and every hour that slipped away was an hour they would never get back. She checked every transaction from the past 6 months, every dollar in and out, every figure no matter how small. She built spreadsheets, drew diagrams, connected the dots like a detective trying to find a killer. And on the 3rd night, while Dante was out meeting his sources, Eve found it, the chain of transfers she had noticed the week before. Those small payments to the offshore account. They were not as small as she had thought. When she traced them back to their origin, when she followed each thread through a maze of shell companies and anonymous accounts, she realized the total came to $200,000. $200,000 wired to an account in the Cayman Islands, steady every week, beginning exactly 1 week after the night Derek Morrison vanished from the face of the earth. But what froze Eve in her chair was not the number. It was the name. Every transfer had been authorized by the same person, the only person besides Dante with access to the organization's main accounts The man Eve had met dozens of times over the past 6 months and had always thought of as a gentle gentleman with a grandfather's smile. Vincent Moretti, the chief accountant, 52 years old, had worked for Dante for 12 years. Eve called Dante, and 20 minutes later he was standing in the office, staring at the laptop screen with a face carved from stone. She explained each step, each number, each piece of proof she had found, and with every word she spoke she saw something in Dante's eyes crack. Not the anger she expected. Pain. The pain of betrayal. Dante took a step back, one hand gripping the back of a chair as if he needed something to keep himself upright, and for the first time, she heard his voice tremble. He said it could not be Vincent, that Vincent had been with him since he was 24, when he was just a reckless kid with ambition and nothing in his hands but nerve. Vincent had saved his life 8 years earlier, when a negotiation collapsed and he was ambushed by a rival crew. Vincent had dragged him out of a burning car, had gotten him to a hospital while blood poured from the wound in his abdomen. Vincent was the man Dante trusted like a father, maybe more than his own father. Eve said nothing. She only turned the laptop screen toward Dante and let the evidence speak for itself. Numbers did not lie. Transactions did not hide, and after a silence that stretched into forever, Dante lifted his head, and the pain was gone from his eyes, leaving only the ruthless coldness of a boss who had made a decision. They could not confront Vincent directly. If he truly was the blackmailer, he was holding the proof, the photos, and the witness he threatened to send to the FBI. They needed to recover those things before they moved. Dante made a plan. He would contact the blackmailer through the phone number left in the envelope, pretend to agree to pay, set the exchange in a suburban parking lot on the 7th night, the final day of the deadline. Meanwhile, Eve would break into Vincent's house to find and destroy any evidence he was keeping. She would not go alone. Dante called Zoe Chen, a 24-year-old woman with blue-dyed hair and bright eyes like someone who had never slept enough. Zoe was a computer genius, the kind of person who could hack into the FBI's system while eating pizza and watching Netflix, and she freelanced for Dante's organization whenever she needed money, or whenever the job was interesting enough to catch her attention. Over the next 3 days, Zoe taught Eve the basics: how to bypass security systems, how to find and copy data from a computer, how to leave no trace. Eve learned fast, faster than she expected, and Zoe watched her with impressed eyes, saying that if she were not the boss's girlfriend, she could have a future in hacking. The 7th night arrived faster than they wanted. The plan was ready. Dante would go to the parking lot with a briefcase of fake money, and Luca with 6 men hiding around the area. Eve and Zoe would break into Vincent's house, find the evidence, destroy everything. 2 prongs at once. No one could escape. A perfect plan. 2 prongs at once. It could not fail. Or at least, that was what they thought, because none of them knew the real enemy was standing much closer than they realized. On the 7th night, the Miami sky was black as ink, and the air hung heavy with the smell of rain on the verge of falling. Dante sat in a black Mercedes parked in the shadowed corner of a suburban lot, the briefcase of fake money on the passenger seat beside him, his eyes sweeping the surrounding darkness, where Luca and 6 of his men were lying in wait. The clock read 11 at night, the exact time named in the message the blackmailer had sent back. 11:05, 11:10, 11:15. No one came. The lot stayed as still as a graveyard, only the wind worrying the tarps of shuttered stalls and the distant hum of engines on the highway. Dante felt a chill spread through his chest, the kind of feeling he had learned to trust after years in the underworld. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He pulled out his phone and called Eve, but no one answered. He called again, a 3rd time, still nothing. And that was when Dante understood. This was not an exchange. This was a trap. A trap to pull him out of the penthouse, out from under the protection of his security system, and most of all, to pull him far away from Eve. He shouted for Luca to drive to Vincent's house immediately, his voice the roar of a predator that had just realized its prey was in danger. At the same time, across the city, Eve and Zoe were standing inside Vincent Moretti's darkened house. Everything was too easy enough to feel suspicious. The door was unlocked. The security system was off. No one was home. Zoe sat at Vincent's computer, her fingers flying over the keys like she was playing piano, and within minutes she found it. A hidden folder packed with still images pulled from Velvet's security feed. Images of Dante standing in Derek Morrison's office with a gun in his hand. Images of Luca dragging Derek's body out of the room. Images of Eve clutching the cut along her ribs with blood soaking through her shirt. Proof. All of it was here. Eve let out a breath of relief, thinking they had won, that the nightmare was about to end. She told Zoe to copy everything, and then wipe it clean, and Zoe nodded, still typing without pause, and then the lights snapped on. Not one light, but all of them at once, as if someone had thrown the main breaker. Harsh white glare flooded the room, and Eve heard a sound she would never forget as long as she lived. FBI, freeze. 10 agents appeared from every direction, from behind a door, from inside a closet, from the hallway, from shadowed corners Eve had not thought could hide a person. They wore ballistic vests with FBI stamped across the chest, guns leveled at Eve and Zoe, shouting orders to put their hands on their heads and get down on their knees. Eve froze for a heartbeat, but Zoe did not. The blue-haired girl moved like lightning, vaulting over the desk and sprinting for the back door they had left open when they came in. An agent chased her, but Zoe was faster, vanishing into the dark as if she had been born to run. Eve did not have that luck. Before she could move, 2 agents seized her arms, drove her to the floor, and cuffed her wrists with the cold click of metal. Her cheek was pressed to the icy wood, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw a pair of black high heels step closer. A woman knelt in front of her, sharp-featured with brown eyes emptied of emotion, black hair cut short and neat, and the smile of someone who had finally caught her quarry after years of pursuit. She introduced herself as Agent Rebecca Torres, and she had been waiting for this moment a long time. What Torres said next made Eve's world collapse completely. Vincent Moretti was not the blackmailer. Vincent Moretti had been an FBI informant for 3 years, from before Eve had ever entered Dante's life. Everything, the blackmail, the envelope, the 7-day deadline, was a trap. A trap to force Dante to move, to bring him into the open, to create fresh evidence when the old evidence was not enough to convict him. And Eve, Torres said with a voice that was almost pity, Eve was only a bonus, an unexpected prize they had never dared hope for. They hauled Eve up and marched her out to a car, and as she sat in the back seat with her wrists cuffed and 2 agents bracketing her, Torres leaned in through the window and said something that made Eve's blood turn to ice. Torres knew everything about her, about Stillwater, Oklahoma, about Robert Harper and the trial, about Ethan and that night, about 8 years on the run, about everything. Torres said Eve could end it all right here, in federal prison, with a sentence for complicity in murder and criminal enterprise. Or she could help them. That was all. Then Torres shut the door and ordered the driver to go. Eve sat in an FBI interrogation room, her wrist cuffed to a cold metal table, white neon light aimed straight at her face, and she realized a brutal truth. She had walked straight into the very trap the FBI had been setting for 3 years. And Dante, the man she loved, the man who had just realized she was gone, was charging headlong into it to save her. The interrogation room was small and cold. Bare gray walls without a window, only a metal table, 2 chairs, and harsh white neon pouring down like it meant to burn every secret clean. Eve sat there with her wrists still cuffed to the iron bar on the tabletop, watching Agent Rebecca Torres set a thick file in front of her. Torres opened it slowly, deliberately, making sure Eve saw every page, every photograph, every bold line on white paper. 12 murders in 10 years. Money laundering through a network of more than 50 shell companies. Arms smuggling to embargoed countries. Control of 60% of organized crime in South Florida. Torres turned each page with the patience of someone who knew she held every card, and when she slid a photograph of Dante across the table toward Eve, her voice turned sweet in a way that was almost mocking. This is the man you love. A monster wearing human skin. A cold-blooded killer who has taken the lives of so many innocent people. Did you know that, Miss Harper? Eve looked at the photograph, at Dante's familiar face with its dark eyes and sharp lines, and she did not react. No shock, no tears, no desperate denial the way Torres was clearly hoping for. Because Eve already knew. She had known who Dante was from the first night, from the moment he stood in the doorway with a gun in his hand and the eyes of a killer. She had chosen to stay with her eyes open, with full understanding of what he was and what he had done. Torres saw her tactic was not working and shifted her approach. She stood, walked to the screen mounted on the wall that Eve had not noticed until now, and turned it on. The image that appeared was security footage, and what Eve saw made her heart stop for a beat. Dante was standing in a warehouse, Luca beside him, and dozens of other men around them, all carrying heavy weapons, assault rifles, grenade launchers, body armor. They were preparing for war, Torres explained in a tone as calm as a weather report. Dante Valenti has gathered his entire force. He is planning to attack an FBI headquarters to extract you. A suicide assault on one of the most heavily protected buildings in America. If he does that, he will die. Or if by some miracle he survives, he will be sentenced to death for attacking federal agents. Either way, the result is the same. Dante Valenti will die. Because of you. Eve stared at the screen, at Dante giving orders with a face set in iron and eyes burning, and she understood he was not bluffing. He would truly do it. He would burn the whole world if that was the only way to save her. Dante was ready to die for her, but she could not let him die. Not for her, never for her. She had already lost too many people, had watched Ethan disappear right in front of her, had lived with that pain for 8 years. She could not bear losing one more person, especially not him, especially not because of her. And in that moment, Eve saw the only way to save Dante. If he attacked the FBI to rescue her, he would die. But if there was no one to rescue, if she was no longer the reason for him to fight, he would stop. The only way to make him stop was to make sure he had no reason to come, and the only way to do that was to betray him. Eve looked at Torres, and for the first time since her arrest, she opened her mouth. She said she wanted to make a deal. Torres lifted an eyebrow, clearly trying to hide her surprise. Eve went on. She would talk. She would give the FBI everything they needed to convict Dante. She would testify in court. But on one condition, Dante would receive a maximum sentence of 15 years. Not life, not death. 15 years, and with good behavior, it could be reduced to 7 or 8. Torres was silent for a long time, weighing the offer. Eve knew this would not be easy, that the FBI had hunted Dante for years and wanted him to rot in prison. But Torres also knew that without Eve, their case was much weaker. The evidence from Vincent could be torn apart by Dante's lawyers, and the risk of Dante attacking an FBI headquarters was real, and agents would die if it happened. Finally, Torres nodded. She said they had a deal, that she would make sure the prosecutor honored Eve's condition. She placed a stack of blank paper and a pen in front of Eve, then left the room so Eve could begin to write. Eve picked up the pen, and her hand shook, not from fear, not from cold, but because she knew that with every word she wrote, she was destroying everything. She was betraying the man who had saved her from Derek Morrison. She was betraying the man who had given her a home for the first time in her life. She was betraying the man who had loved her with all her scars and all her ghosts. She was betraying the man she loved. To save his life. Tears fell onto the page as Eve began to write, letter by letter, line by line, telling everything she knew about the empire of Dante Valenti. When Eve signed the statement, her hand shook, but not from fear. It was because she knew that with every word she had written, she had destroyed the only relationship that had ever made her feel loved. She was betraying the man she loved to save his life. The courtroom was packed, but for Eve there were only 2 people in it, herself and Dante. She stood at the witness stand, one hand resting on the Bible she had just sworn on to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and it felt as if that oath were lodged in her throat. Dante sat at the defendant's table, only a few yards away and yet as distant as if an ocean lay between them. He wore a black suit, his hair neatly combed, and he still looked like a powerful boss even on trial. But what made it hard for Eve to breathe were his eyes. He stared at her without blinking, his face blank of emotion. But those eyes, the dark eyes she had loved for 6 months, looked at her as if she were a stranger. The prosecutor began to ask questions, and Eve answered. She spoke about Dante's organizational structure, about the people who led each division, about how money was laundered through a web of shell companies. She spoke about the transactions she had managed, the numbers she had seen, the meetings she had attended. Her voice was flat as a machine, without feeling, without tremor, because if she allowed herself to feel anything at all, she would collapse right there on the stand. And then the prosecutor asked about Derek Morrison. It felt as if someone had punched Eve in the chest. She told them about that night, about the soundproof office, the knife and the cut along her ribs, the door blown off its hinges and the man in the doorway with a gun in his hand. She told them Derek being dragged away and the gunshot echoing from far off, and how she understood he would never come back. The prosecutor leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. Did the defendant say anything to you about the Morrison incident? Eve stopped. She knew the answer would nail Dante to the wall, would become undeniable proof of his complicity in Derek's death. She knew she had to say it, that it was part of the deal, that it was why she was here, but she could not. She could not open her mouth. The prosecutor asked again, his tone harder. Eve closed her eyes for a heartbeat, drew in a deep breath, and for the first time since she entered the courtroom, she looked straight into Dante's eyes. He was still watching her, still unblinking, still expressionless, but Eve knew him. She had slept in his arms, had seen him when he let every wall fall away, and she saw what no one else in that courtroom could see: pain, betrayal, a heart breaking behind those cold eyes. Eve opened her mouth, and her voice came out as a whisper the entire courtroom had to fall silent to hear. He said, "You touched what belongs to me." A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor smiled as if he had just won the biggest gamble of his life. And Dante said nothing, never took his eyes off her. But Eve saw his jaw clench, saw his hands curl into fists beneath the table. The trial ended 3 days later. The jury needed only 4 hours to return a verdict: guilty. On every count, Dante Valenti was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of reduction to 7 years for good behavior. When the marshals stepped forward to cuff Dante, he rose, and for the first time through the entire trial, he spoke. Not to the judge, not to his attorney, but to Eve. Only 4 words: "I trusted you." Then he turned his back and let them lead him away, without looking back, without any other gesture, as if Eve no longer existed in his world. Eve was released under the deal, exactly as Torres had promised. She walked out of the courthouse into a gray afternoon, the Miami sky thick with clouds as if the whole city were mourning something. No one was waiting for her. No Dante by the black Mercedes. No Luca giving her a respectful nod. No one. For the first time in 6 months, Eve was completely alone. She stood on the courthouse steps, watching the prisoner transport carrying Dante roll farther and farther away, vanish around the corner, vanish from her life. She had saved his life. She had kept him alive. But she had also lost him forever. Eve stood on the courthouse steps, watching the vehicle that carried Dante grow distant. She had saved his life. But she had also lost him forever. And this time, she was not sure she still had the strength to keep running. Eve left Miami 3 days after the trial, carrying a small suitcase and a heart shattered into a million pieces. She drove south, over the bridges that stitched the small islands of the Florida Keys together, until she reached Key West, the southernmost point of the United States, where the land ended and the sea began. She chose it because it was far enough from Miami to outrun the memories, but close enough that she could pretend she had not fully left him behind. She rented a small apartment on the 2nd floor of an old building facing the water, where she could hear the waves every night and watch the sunset every afternoon. She found work at a local fishing company, doing accounting for a paycheck that was just enough to live on, and she began to build her new life from nothing. That new life was so lonely it hurt. Eve did not make friends. She went to work, came home, cooked alone, slept alone, woke up alone. When coworkers invited her out for drinks after hours, she said no. When the elderly landlady tried to introduce her to her single grandson, Eve was polite but firm and said no. She did not want anyone close, not because she feared being hurt, but because she did not believe she deserved happiness, not after what she had done. Every month, Eve wrote a letter to the federal prison where Dante was serving his sentence. She told him about Key West, about the sea and the sunsets, about her job and her small apartment. She told him about the nights she could not sleep because she was thinking of him, about the times she wanted to explain but did not know where to begin. She never apologized in those letters, because she knew an apology would be meaningless, because she would do the same thing again if she had to choose again. But she wanted him to know she was still here, still waiting, still loving him, even if he might never forgive her. Not one letter was answered. 84 letters over 7 years, and not once did Eve receive anything from Dante. She did not know if he read them, burned them, or if they were stacked in some corner of a locker in his cell. She only knew that silence hurt more than any curse ever could. Twice in 7 years, Eve drove north to the prison to visit Dante. The first time was after 1 year, when she thought maybe time had been enough to cool his anger. The second time was after 3 years, when she could not stand the silence anymore. Both times, Dante refused to see her. The guard looked at her with pity as he told her the inmate did not want visitors, and Eve had to drive back in tears, wondering if she was trying for nothing. But she did not quit. She did not know why. Maybe because she was used to waiting, used to hoping for things that seemed impossible. She worked hard, saved money even though she did not know what it was for, as if she were preparing for a future she did not dare believe would come. Every night before sleep, Eve took the necklace Dante had given her out of its box, a delicate silver chain with a small heart pendant, the only thing she had kept from her former life. She lay in the dark with the necklace clenched in her fist and wondered whether he ever thought of her, whether he was all right, whether he still hated her. The guilt never eased. It was there each morning when she woke, each afternoon when she watched the sun sink, each night when she lay alone in the empty room. But Eve did not regret it. She could not regret saving his life, even if the price was losing him forever. If she could choose again, she would do the same. She would rather have him hate her and live than love her and die. 7 years, 2,555 days, 84 letters with no reply, and a heart that kept beating only because of the hope that one day the prison doors would open, and she would finally have a chance to explain why she did what she did. Eve arrived at the prison gate at 5 in the morning, when the sky was still black and the early fog lay thick over the empty parking lot. She sat in the old car she had bought with the savings from 7 years of accounting work, one hand wrapped around a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold long ago, staring at the massive iron gate ahead. Today was the day Dante got out. 7 years for good behavior, exactly as the agreement she signed with Torres in that cold interrogation room had promised. She had counted every day, crossed off every square on the calendar hanging in her kitchen, waited for this moment through 2,555 days. But now that it was close enough to touch, she was so afraid she wanted to run. She did not know if Dante wanted to see her. He had refused her twice in 7 years, had never answered the 84 letters she sent. Maybe he would walk through the gate, see her, and keep going without a word. Maybe he would look at her with eyes full of hate and tell her she had destroyed his life. Maybe this was the biggest mistake she had ever made. But she was here anyway. She could not be here. 7 in the morning. The sun began to rise and the fog slowly thinned. 8. The prison gate opened, and a few people stepped out, met by family in tears and tight embraces. 9. Eve was still sitting there, her hands trembling from cold and from nerves, her gaze locked on the gate. And then, at 9:17, she saw him. Dante Valenti walked out through the prison gate in plain civilian clothes, a small duffel in his hand, morning sunlight striking his face. He was 43 now. 7 years older than the last time she had seen him in the courtroom. There was more silver at his temples. His face was harsher with lines she did not remember, and his eyes, those dark eyes, looked more tired but still sharp as ever. Yet there was still strength in the way he moved, still authority in the way he carried himself, as if 7 years behind bars had not been able to break the man he was. Dante stopped when he saw Eve standing beside her old car. He did not speak, did not move, only stood there and looked at her with a blank expression. Eve walked toward him one step at a time, her legs heavy as lead, her heart hammering in her chest. She stopped a few steps away, close enough to see the new silver strands in his hair, far enough that he could not touch her if he wanted to hit her. Silence stretched between them, heavy as a sentence. 1 minute, 2. No one spoke, no one moved, only the wind sliding through the lot and the distant rush of traffic on the highway. At last, Eve opened her mouth, her voice rough as if she had not spoken to anyone in years. She said she knew he might never forgive her, that she was not here to ask for forgiveness, that she only wanted him to know why she had done what she did. Dante still did not speak, still only watched her, and Eve began to think he would turn away and leave. But then he opened his mouth, and what he said froze her. He said he had read every one of her letters, every single one of the 84 she had sent across 7 years. He said he had refused to see her because he did not know what he would do if he looked at her, did not know if he would hold her or scream at her or do something he would regret. He said he hated her for betraying him, hated her for standing on the witness stand and repeating his words, hated her for taking 7 years of his life. But he also could not stop loving her, no matter how he tried, no matter how badly he wanted to, even though he knew loving her was the stupidest thing he had ever done. Eve felt tears spill over, and she told him everything, about Torres and the interrogation room, about the security footage that showed him gathering his forces to attack the FBI, about how she knew that if he did it, he would die or be sentenced to death, about how she realized the only way to save him was to make sure he no longer had a reason to come. She said she could not let him die for her, that she had already lost Ethan and she could not lose one more person, that she would rather have him hate her and live than love her and die. Dante was silent for a long time after she finished, his face unreadable. Then he asked, his voice low and rough, "You betrayed me to save my life?" Eve nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. She said she would do it again if she had to, that she was sorry for the pain she had caused, but she was not sorry for keeping him alive. Dante did not say he forgave her. He did not say it was all right, that he understood, that he was no longer angry, but he did not walk away either. Instead, he asked a simple question, his voice a little softer than before. "Where do you live?" And Eve knew, in that moment, that it was everything she needed to begin again. Dante did not go back to Miami. There was nothing left to go back to. In the 7 years he spent in prison, the empire he had built over 15 years had been torn apart by rivals like vultures stripping a carcass. Luca had tried to hold on to what remained, but without Dante, it all collapsed one piece at a time. The men who once bowed their heads to him now pledged themselves elsewhere. The territory he once controlled now belonged to other hands, and the name Dante Valenti had become nothing more than an old story people told in dim bars. He followed Eve to Key West, carrying a small duffel bag and nothing else. Her apartment was smaller than the bathroom in the penthouse they once lived in back in Miami, but it had a window that looked out on the sea, and it had Eve, and that was all he needed, or at least that was what he told himself. The first days were harder than either of them expected. They shared the same bed because the apartment had only one, but they lay on opposite edges without touching, an invisible space between them like a chasm. Some nights, Dante did not speak a single word to Eve, only sat on the balcony for hours, staring out at the water, his eyes distant as if he were someplace Eve could not reach. Sometimes he looked at her with a kind of pain so sharp it made Eve want to drop to her knees and apologize again. But she did not. She knew apologies could not stitch a wound closed. Only time could do that. So she did not push, did not explain again, did not demand forgiveness. She simply stayed, cooked for him, made coffee for him every morning, and waited. After 2 weeks, Dante began to go out. He found work at a boat repair shop by the docks, where the owner was an old man who did not care about anyone's past, only whether they knew how to work. Dante learned fast. The hands that once signed death sentences now learned to sand wood and paint hulls, to tie lines and replace engines. For the first time in his life, he worked an honest job with his own body, earning money from his own sweat instead of other people's blood. The feeling was strange, like wearing a shirt that did not quite fit, but it also brought a quiet kind of peace he had never known. The turning point came one night, about a month after Dante got out. Eve woke screaming, her body slick with sweat and shaking, and when Dante snapped on the light, he saw her crying, her eyes still glazed as if she had not fully escaped the nightmare. She called Ethan's name, called for the brother who had died 15 years earlier, and the pain in her voice was something Dante understood too well. He did not think, did not hesitate, instinct moving before reason. He pulled her into his arms, held her tight, and for the first time since leaving prison, he touched her. Eve sobbed against him, sobbing for Ethan, for Derek, for the trial, for 7 years of loneliness, for everything she had lost, and everything she had been forced to sacrifice. And Dante held her, said nothing, only held her until the crying eased and her breathing evened out. Then he spoke, his voice a whisper in the dark. He said he did not forgive what she had done, that he did not know if he ever would, but he understood why she had done it. He had had 7 years in prison to think, to turn it over from every angle, to ask himself what he would have done in her place, and he still loved her. He did not know how to stop loving her, even though he had tried, even though he wanted to hate her because it would have been easier. From that night on, everything began to change. The space between them in bed slowly narrowed. Their conversations grew longer, deeper. Dante began to tell Eve about 7 years inside, about long nights staring at a ceiling and reading her letters, about how he had learned to control his anger so he would not go mad. Eve told him about Key West, about the job, about the nights she held the necklace he had given her, and wondered whether he still thought of her. Slowly, piece by piece, they found each other again, like two people fitting together the fragments of a picture that had been shattered. It was not like before. It could not be like before, because they were not the same people anymore. But it was not worse, only different. They were no longer Dante Valenti, the boss of Miami, and Eve Harper, his right hand. They were simply two people who had been through hell and somehow still found each other on the other side. 3 years had passed since the day Dante walked out through the prison gate, and their life had found a quiet rhythm neither of them had dared to imagine before. They had moved from the small apartment into a sweet little wooden house near the harbor, with a porch that faced the sea, and a small yard, just big enough for a few pots of flowers. Lucky, the mixed-breed dog they had adopted from a rescue shelter 2 years earlier, lay lazily on the porch each afternoon, tail thumping whenever one of them came home. Dante still worked repairing boats, and now he had become the best mechanic on the docks, trusted by customers and respected by the others. Eve had left the fishing company and opened a small cafe in town, where she sold pour-over coffee and her own baked pastries to tourists and locals. They had healed, not completely, with scars that would never fully close, but enough to be happy in their own way. That afternoon, Eve was in the kitchen preparing dinner when there was a knock at the door. Lucky barked. Not a greeting bark, but the wary bark of a dog that had scented a stranger. Eve wiped her hands on a towel and went to open the door, and the man she saw made the survival instinct she thought had been asleep for 10 years snap awake. The man standing there looked about 45, tall, broad-shouldered, with the stance of someone long accustomed to violence. His face was hard, a scar running from his temple down to his left cheekbone, and his eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen too much, swept over Eve with a cold appraisal. He asked if Dante Valenti was here, his voice low, and even as if he were asking for directions to the post office. Eve felt her blood turn to ice, but she kept her face calm. She said she did not know anyone by that name, that he must have the wrong address. The man only smiled, a smile with no humor in it at all, and said she did not need to pretend, Miss Harper, that he knew who she was, knew what she had done, knew everything. Then he introduced himself as Marco Benedetti, a former member of the Valenti organization, just out of prison after 8 years, and he had information he thought Dante would want to hear. Eve did not let Marco into the house. She told him to wait on the porch, called Dante. And for the most tense 20 minutes since she left Miami, she stood at the door with a kitchen knife hidden behind her back, while Marco sat on the steps petting Lucky as if this were an ordinary social call. When Dante arrived, Eve saw the change on his face at once. The man who had lived a quiet life for 3 years vanished, and in a heartbeat the old boss of Miami returned. His eyes turned cold and sharp, his shoulders squared, and his stride carried the silent threat Eve had not seen since the night he blew the door off Derek Morrison's office. Dante asked what Marco wanted, his voice not the voice of a boat mechanic in Key West, but the voice of a man who had once commanded hundreds and decided who lived and who died. Marco stood, brushed dust from his pants, and said he had information Dante needed, information about the night Derek Morrison died. Eve felt as if someone had poured a bucket of ice water down her spine. That name, the name they had not spoken in years, rose up like a ghost from the past. Marco said that in prison he had met someone, a drunk hitman named Tony Ricci, who bragged about his jobs. Tony had been proud that he had handled a club manager named Derek Morrison, taking $50,000 for a clean job. But what caught Marco's attention was not the killing. It was who had hired Tony, because that person worked for Dante himself, one of his closest men. Marco stopped there and let the words hang in the air like a blade about to fall. He said that if Dante wanted more, they needed to talk in private, not here, not in front of Eve. Dante looked at Marco with eyes that gave nothing away. No anger, no surprise, only the cold calculation of a man weighing every possibility. And Eve stood there, her hand still tight around the knife behind her back, feeling a chill crawl along her spine, the sense that the past they believed they had buried was about to push the lid off its coffin. Dante and Marco sat on the back porch of the house, only a few yards from Eve, close enough that she could still hear every word. She stood in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes, but really she was straining to listen, her heart hammering in her chest. Marco spoke slowly, his voice low and even as if he were reading off a report instead of exposing a secret that could change everything. In prison, Marco had met Tony Ricci, a professional hitman serving 20 years for a different murder. Tony was the kind of man who liked to brag when he was drunk, liked to talk about his jobs the way other men talked about victories. One night, while the two of them were drinking contraband liquor in a cell, Tony started telling the story of the biggest payday of his life. $50,000 to handle a nightclub manager named Derek Morrison. Clean work. No trace. No witnesses. Tony boasted that he had been waiting in the shadows of the basement, and he was the one who pulled the trigger the moment Derek was dragged downstairs, making it look like a standard execution before Dante's loyal men could even realize a stranger was among them. Thought it was his own order being carried out. Marco stopped there and stared at Dante without blinking, and the person who hired Tony, the person who paid that $50,000, was Vincent Moretti. Eve felt her legs buckle. She had to grab the sink to keep from falling, and the dish in her hand slipped and shattered with a crash she did not even hear. Vincent Moretti, the chief accountant, the man Dante trusted like a father, the man they believed had betrayed Dante by blackmailing him. But the betrayal was deeper, darker, than anything they had imagined. Marco kept talking, and with each word, Eve's world collapsed a little more. Vincent had orchestrated the execution to happen under Dante's name. When Dante ordered Derek to be taken to the basement, he didn't know that one of the men trailing behind Luca was actually Tony Ricci, the hitman Vincent had hired to ensure Derek never left that building alive. Vincent had staged the scene perfectly so Dante would believe he himself had ordered it, that his men had carried out his will the way he wanted. The gunshot Eve had heard that night was not the shot that finished Derek. The gunshot Eve had heard that night was real, but it wasn't fired by Dante's order or his loyal people. It was Tony Ricci, who fired the shot specifically to create the definitive evidence Vincent needed to hand over to the FBI, ensuring there were no loose ends. It had all been theater. Vincent had been planning to frame Dante for years, from before Eve ever entered Dante's life. He wanted to topple Dante and take the empire he had helped build for 12 years, and he needed a way to remove Dante without dirtying his own hands. The FBI was the perfect tool. Vincent became an informant, fed the Bureau information, and waited for his chance. When Dante started to care about Eve, when Derek Morrison became a threat to her, Vincent saw a golden opening. He hired Tony to kill Derek, staged it so Dante would think it was his own order, then blackmailed Dante with evidence of a murder Dante had never committed. A perfect trap. And all of them, Dante, Eve, Luca, all of them had walked into it. Eve did not know when she had stepped out onto the porch. She only knew she was standing there now, staring at Dante through eyes blurred with tears, unable to breathe. Dante had not killed Derek Morrison. He had never killed Derek Morrison. She had stood on the witness stand and testified to a crime he did not commit. She had betrayed him, destroyed what they had, sent him to prison for 7 years, all because of a lie. She dropped to her knees and a sob tore out of her throat like the cry of a wounded animal. Through the choking sound of it, she said she had betrayed him for a crime he did not commit, that everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, the 7 years of his life that were stolen, had been meaningless. She had thought she was saving him, but she had only helped Vincent finish his plan. She cried and cried, unable to stop, and she thought Dante would stand and walk away, that this would be the moment he finally hated her the way she deserved. But he did not. Instead, Dante knelt beside her and did the last thing Eve expected. He held her. He held her tight, the way he had that first night she woke from a nightmare after he got out, as if she were the most precious thing in the world and he was afraid to lose her. And he told her, his voice low and gentle at her ear, that she had acted on the information she had, that she believed he had killed Derek, that she had saved his life, the only way she knew how. He said he did not blame her, that he could not blame her for loving him enough to betray him. He blamed Vincent. He blamed the man who had built the whole stage, who had turned her into a tool in a plan she never even knew existed. Marco rose and quietly left, giving them the porch to themselves. Eve wept in Dante's arms, not from relief, not from forgiveness, but because she had just realized she had sacrificed everything, the relationship, the trust, 7 years of a life, for a lie, and the only person who truly deserved blame had died in prison 2 years earlier, taking every crime down into the grave without ever paying the price. The weeks after Marco left were the longest weeks of Eve's life. Dante grew quieter than usual, spending hours on the porch staring out at the sea with his phone in his hand, calling people Eve did not know, speaking in a coded language she could not understand. He was verifying Marco's story, reaching out to old contacts, people who still owed him from the days when he had been the boss of Miami, people with eyes and ears in the underworld who knew secrets ordinary people never touched. Eve did not ask, did not push, only waited the way she had waited through 7 years. And after 3 weeks, Dante finally told her. Everything had been confirmed. Vincent Moretti really had hired Tony Ricci to kill Derek Morrison. It was all true. Dante had been framed, had lost 7 years of his life for a crime he did not commit. Eve felt fury flare in her chest, the kind of anger she had never known before. She told Dante he had to do something, that people had to know the truth, that he could not let it pass as if those 7 years did not matter. He had been wronged. Vincent should pay. But Dante only shook his head with a sad smile. He said Vincent had died in prison 2 years earlier, his heart stopping in his sleep, a death far too gentle for a man who had caused so much suffering. There was no one left to take revenge on, no one left to demand justice from. Eve refused to accept it. She said they could go to the FBI. They could tell them the truth. They could clear Dante's name and wipe his record clean. She said he deserved to be recognized as innocent. deserved to reclaim the years that had been stolen. But Dante looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, lost too much, and he asked her a question that left her silent. He asked whether she truly wanted him to go back to that world. He explained that to clear his name, he would have to dig up the past, face people he wanted to forget, maybe do things he did not want to do anymore. He would have to become Dante Valenti, the boss of Miami, again, even if only for a while, and he did not know if he could return to this quiet life after putting his hands in the mud again, and worst of all, he could lose her. Again. Eve opened her mouth to argue, but Dante went on. He said the best revenge was the life they had built. He had had 7 years in prison to think, 7 years to look back at everything he had done and everything he had lost, and he had realized that power, money, and empire, none of it was worth more than peace. Nothing was worth waking up each morning beside the person you loved, an honest job in a small house facing the sea, a dog asleep at your feet and the sound of waves each night. He asked her whether she wanted to risk everything they had now for the 2-word promise of justice. Eve looked into Dante's eyes, looked at the man who had walked through hell and found his way back to her, and she understood. They had already lost too much. She had lost Ethan, lost her father, lost 8 years of wandering with no home. He had lost an empire, lost 7 years of freedom, lost his trust in the man he had treated like a father. They had lost 6 months of happiness and 10 years of suffering. Enough. More than enough. Eve nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she said she agreed. She agreed to let the past rest, to let Vincent Moretti carry his crimes into the grave, to keep living the life they had fought to earn. That night, they sat on the porch with a small metal barrel and a box of matches. Dante placed every document connected to the matter inside. Marco's notes, messages from old contacts, every piece of evidence of the truth they had uncovered. Then he struck a flame. Eve watched the fire devour the past, watched the pages curl into ash and drift away on the ocean wind, and she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not because she had been forgiven, but because at last, after 10 years of carrying guilt like an iron chain around her neck, she allowed herself to forgive herself. 3 years after the day Dante walked out through the prison gate, the little house facing the sea in Key West still stood there, a bit older now with paint faded by sun and salt wind, but warmer than it had ever been. The porch now held 2 rocking chairs Dante had built with his own hands, set side by side at the perfect angle to watch the sunset each evening. Lucky lay at their feet, much older now with silver creeping around his muzzle, but still faithful, tail thumping whenever one of them came home. Dante was 46 now, his hair more gray and the lines around his eyes deeper, but he was healthier and tougher than ever from working with his hands every day. He still repaired boats at the harbor, and now the whole town loved him not because they knew who he used to be, but because they knew who he was now. A quiet man with a good heart, always ready to help a neighbor, always careful and fair with every customer. Eve was 37, and she had not been that bartender running from her past for a long time. Her cafe, Second Chance, had become one of the most beloved places in Key West, not only because the coffee was good and the pastries were wonderful, but because of the story behind it. Eve hired people who needed a second chance, former inmates trying to start over, women escaping domestic violence, lost souls searching for a way home. She understood them, because she had once been them. Marco Benedetti was now their close friend, working at the docks with Dante and coming over for Sunday dinner often. They had a few other friends too, kind neighbors, regular customers who had become family. Life was simple, no empires or power, no money or luxury, but whole in a way neither Dante nor Eve would have dared dream of 10 years earlier. That evening, they sat on the porch the way they did most evenings, hand in hand, watching the sun sink slowly into the sea in a painting of fierce orange and pink. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and the fragrance of flowers from the small garden Eve tended, and the soft hush of waves sounded like a wordless song. Dante squeezed her hand and said he regretted nothing, not even the 7 years in prison, because it had all led him here, to this moment, with her. Eve rested her head on his shoulder and said she regretted many things, the pain she had caused, the choices she had made, the years they had lost, but she had never regretted loving him. Dante turned to look at her, his dark eyes warm in the sunset light, and he asked if she had to do it all again. Would she? Eve smiled, the smile he had loved from the first night he saw her behind Velvet's bar, and she answered that she would, every choice, every time. They kissed as the sun slipped beneath the water, slow and gentle, like two people who had a lifetime to love and no need to hurry. Lucky barked for dinner and broke the romantic spell, and they both laughed, rose, and went inside together. An ordinary life, the life they had fought for across 10 years. Evelyn Harper and Dante Valenti had begun their story in violence and chaos, but they were ending it, or at least this chapter of it, in peace and love, and in the deep understanding that only comes from surviving the impossible together. The bartender from Oklahoma and the boss from Miami, a pairing no one would have expected, yet somehow perfect. Even Dante's story teaches us that real love is not something perfect, but a choice to stay through the most imperfect moments, that sometimes the greatest betrayal can come from the deepest love, that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but choosing to keep walking together even knowing the scars will remain, and most of all, that each of us deserves a second chance, no matter how dark our past may be. That is the complete story of Eve and Dante. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss any videos. Leave a like if you felt every rise and fall of emotion in their journey, and share this video with anyone who believes love can overcome anything, even betrayal, prison, and lies. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever faced choices in life with no right answer? If you were in Eve's place, would you make the same decision? We would truly love to hear what you felt deep in your heart in the comments below. Every comment you leave is the motivation that helps us keep bringing meaningful stories each day. We wish all of you watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.